Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the IICRC Certified Firm webinar series. Today's webinar is Success on Water Losses, Best Practices, and How to Correctly Utilize the S500. Our presenter is Dan Mesenburg. Dan is an IICRC Approved WRT, ASD, FSRT, and OCT Instructor, as well as Chair of the WRT Technical Advisory Committee. Dan has previously volunteered on technical advisory committees for the ASD and FSRT, and currently serves as a member of the IICRC Board of Directors. Dan owns his own certified firm in Minnesota and works as a training manager for ServiceMaster Clean Restore throughout the Midwest. Before I turn it over to Dan, just a couple housekeeping items. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat section on the right. Dan will do his best to respond to you while he's going through his presentation. Otherwise, I will make sure to get back to you either in writing or if we have time at the end of the presentation. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dan. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. We've got the next hour here to spend some time with you and talk about the S500 on water losses. And one of the reasons this topic is very relevant right now is a lot of you deal with insurance companies, or you may deal with the homeowners directly. And we're continually challenged on both our pricing and the practices that we're doing in the home or business that we're taking care of. And so it's very important that we start to follow the standards for our industry, which in this case is the S500. So first and foremost, my little disclaimer is just this, very simple. If you don't have a copy of this document in your business, you need to. I'll give you information on where you can either get a hard copy or a subscription at the end of this webinar. But you need to actually read the standard and understand what's in it, because it is the source of information to help drive a successful water loss. As we look at some of the dates, the new standard was actually released in November of 2015. And about May is when most companies began actually using the new S500. It took us a few months to educate people, to roll out the new copies, and to get them into the field. But the problem is people today are still quoting the old standard, terminology from the old standard, calculations from the old standard, and this is causing confusion in the industry. So whether you're a franchise organization, a mom and pop organization, or a large independent, we as an industry need to all get on the same page and use the standard consistently on every job that we do. If we fail to do that, it takes away from the relevance of the standard, and it also presents more challenges from the insurance companies and those that are approving our bills, saying, well, that standard really doesn't work because you're really not using it. So we want to really stress the fact that we need to all get on board and operate forward the same way. So as we look at the standard, a couple things. The current S500 is one document. In the front, it has blue pages. In the back, it has white pages. Both of these, the blue section actually is the standard itself. The reference guide is the white section. Both of these play off of each other and support each other. So you can actually quote information from either the standard or the reference guide as you're out on jobs, or use either or both, either one or the other, or both, as you work through jobs. So the one thing that they did nicely in the new revision of the standard is if you're in section 10 of the standard, which is sort of like the Cliff Notes version, that will correspond directly to chapter 10 in the reference guide. So if you're in that section 10 and you found something you want to learn more about, go to the reference guide and it will be expanded on also in chapter 10. A couple important terms that we need to understand as you look at the standard. First of all, and we teach these in WRT and ASD as you get certified, but it's always good to have a reminder. Whenever you see the words shall and should, those are components of the standard of care. Shall generally is a mandatory item that's due to regulations, OSHA, EPA, government regulatory agencies in Canada or the UK or Australia. The shalls are going to be things that we need to do on every job. The word should appears in a sentence. That's part of the standard of care to be followed, not by mandatory regulatory requirements, but by what our industry accepts as the proper way to do something. And then you will see some other terms such as recommended, may, and can. Those are not necessarily components of the standard of care, but they're advised or suggested items that should happen during the water loss. So as you look at your standard and you go and look at a category of loss or a safety section of the standard, you're going to see certain words, and these are the key terms that you want to understand what they actually mean when they appear in a sentence in the standard. As we go forward, what we're going to talk today, and you could spend many days on the standard, but I'm going to highlight some things in section and chapter 10, which has to do with our initial inspections, pre-restoration evaluations, things like that. I'm also going to highlight some things in section and chapter 13, which is about structural restoration. And finally, we're going to finish up with section 17, chapter 17, which talks about materials and assemblies. In my position, I work with many insurance companies all across the nation. I also work with many of our franchises at ServiceMaster. And in dealing with those, I get to see many different opportunities to look at how the standard's being interpreted, where we're having trouble interpreting it, and many insurance companies will call me for information as well. These three sections and chapters are probably where there is more room for further development or further education. And these are the three that I usually end up pointing people to. So as you go back, if you want to start reading right where the meat of the book is, go to these three sections and chapters, and you will get the information that you need to properly do a water loss. That doesn't mean you skip the rest, but start here. As we go forward, let's start with chapter 10, section 10. And in this section, one of the first things it talks about is the safety and health. It is very important to the IICRC and to our industry that we protect the safety and health of not only the occupants of the structure, but the workers that are in that structure as well. And so we want to make sure that everybody has a clear understanding that when safety and health items come up, we need to operate in a way that protects not only the occupants, but our workers. And so you will see a few things that we bring up shortly that relate to safety and health of both the occupants and workers, and we want to put that on the forefront of everything that we do. A lot of times we will be asked to cut corners, either by a customer, an insurance company, or maybe even an employee that's been around for 10 years that thinks they know everything. We'll be asked to cut corners on jobs, and what I'm going to tell you is you cannot cut corners if the safety and health or well-being of our occupants and workers is involved. You need to do things by the standard and protect those people. So I want you to just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the next few minutes of discussion. As we look at further in this chapter, it talks about qualifications. Who are you actually sending out on the job? And so we need education, we need training, we need experience. Experience isn't always easy to come by. It takes a while to build up experience, but the training and education can happen right away by simply sending people to an IICRC class, maybe a WRT or ASD. Do you have people that are EPA-led renovators, depending on what your state rules are in your business? Do you have people that are trained to handle mold if that's encountered on a job? But one of the things the standard does talk about is we need to be sending people into jobs that are qualified, which means they have the education, they have the training, and they have the experience. Learning by fire happens a lot in our industry where we throw people into a job and they mirror somebody. That is a way of learning, but we need to take it a step further and make sure the people that are going into jobs can make qualified decisions and understand the standard and the process of doing a water loss. So that's just one thing that's called out at the beginning of this chapter. Another thing it talks about is documentation. Now, on here I have actually a record of drying conditions from one of the many different electronic versions that are out there. But two things we continue to see missed on losses, and I've had the opportunity just last week to work with an insurance company down in Oklahoma City with some desk adjusters, and they are still not seeing documentation that supports the claim. And what I'm going to tell you is you need to paint the picture of what the job looks like, because a lot of times now we don't have an adjuster going to the house and actually looking at it. So do you have a picture of the front of the house of the source of the actual loss before and after demolition? Do you have proper authorizations or contracts signed? I've been in a few court cases, and when you're in a court case, the first thing the judge asks for is, do you have a contract with the customer? And if you did not get an authorization signed, guess what? Get your checkbook out and start writing checks, because the judge is going to rule in favor of the customer, not the contractor. And then the record of drying conditions, that supports the fact that we started out wet and we've dried it to a dry standard. All of this documentation seems like it's a challenge and seems like a lot of extra fluff, but I will tell you, it is there to protect not only you as a business, but your employees and the reputation of your company. It also shows that we've done our job properly. So there's a section on documentation. It calls out 20 or 30 different types of documents, things that you may want to consider. And it also talks about insurance and some things as well that your company should have if you're doing this type of work. So check into that section a little bit further and line your documentation up with the standard and see how you're doing. The next section in here starts to talk about the category of water loss. And there have been changes to the definitions of these categories. Remember that category of water deals with the level of contamination, specifically of the source of the water loss. And you will notice we no longer have special situations. We have category 1, 2, and 3, and then the fourth thing is regulated hazardous materials and mold. I'll explain how these flow together here in the next couple slides. Let's look at painting the picture. I said that earlier, and I'm going to say it many more times. We might come into a loss that has a category 1 loss break, which means a freshwater pipe, a supply line broke. It was clean water right from the city tap coming out into a room. However, things in the room could potentially change the category of that loss. So what I want you to do is this a normal indoor environment that you're entering? That's one way to look at it. Should we have contamination? Do we have potential contamination that could change the water source into something that's less clean? And some of the things you want to look at are, what odors are present? Is there discoloration? You know, one of the old things from the old standard people used to say is, well, it flowed through building materials, so it's changed categories. That's not necessarily true anymore, and it is not in this current standard, is not stated that way. So what you need to do is look for things. You know, are there animal feces on the floor? Was there other things that would degrade? Is this person a hoarder, or are they poor housekeeper that could create a situation of filth that would adversely affect the category of water? So while the category is determined from the source of the water in the structure itself could be a lower category based on the contaminants that are there. What we need you to do is show why the category has changed. Proof in pictures and documentation from, hey, I've got a really pungent odor. All of those things add up to paint the picture for either the homeowner or the insurance company or the third-party administrator to show them that this water has degraded. So let's look at the categories individually. Category 1, still very easy, originates from a sanitary source. There's really no substantial risk to the occupants or the employees or workers because it's clean water. You should be able to almost drink this. Now, I know you're not going to scoop water off the floor and drink it, even if it is category 1, but this is clean water. It doesn't pose a risk. As we go to category 2, things start to change. And one thing we have to be careful of on category 2 is category 2 water does contain a significant amount of contamination. and it has the potential to cause discomfort and sickness to those that are either in contact with it or if it's consumed for some reason. So I want you to be cautious in providing proper PPE to your employees and possibly keeping people out of areas until we've done the initial mitigation of the loss, because this water can cause problems. And I had a student in one of my classes a while back that said, hey, yeah, we had a guy used to only wear tennis shoes in losses, and we never did any sewer losses, but he still got a fungus on his feet. Well, can we say that's from the category 2? Maybe not, but there are contaminants in this water. It is not something you're going to drink, and we want to make sure that we take all precautions. Wear boots, wear gloves, don't get splashed in the face, and do a good job of protecting our workers as we're in these situations. As we look at category 3, as you know, that becomes water that's grossly contaminated. So we're going to have harmful agents, we're going to have potential sewage, it could be flooding. And under examples, the examples bullet here, I really want you to look at a couple things. And I try to underline the items in this presentation that are most important from these categories of loss. But the most important thing for category 3 is waistline backflows. It no longer says toilet backflows, it says waistline backflows that originate from beyond the trap regardless of visible content or color. That's very important because we've had other people, adjusters, third-party administrators say, well, that came out of floor drain and it's clear water, so even though there's 50 gallons that came out of there, it's really a category 2 because it's clear water. Understand, whenever it comes from beyond the trap, regardless of color or content that's visible, it's going to be a category 3. And then flooding is the other example of this. So we want to be cautious on how we work with this. In the Midwest, we have a lot of basements that have sump pumps. So sump pump water, generally that water is filtered by the soil. We would probably say that's going to be a category 2 water loss. However, if we had a flood and that water entered the building directly without being filtered by the soil, flood water is considered a category 3 at that point. So category can be a little difficult, but we just need to look at the level of contaminants. The last thing I'm going to say on category 3s is you may want to look at ATP testing as a way to check your work. When I started 20 years ago in this industry, we'd go into category 3, we'd spray down a bunch of antimicrobial or biocide, we'd sort of mop it up, we'd go away, throw some equipment in, go away after 3 or 4 days and say it looks good. Looks is not good enough anymore. We need to check and see, are these surfaces actually clean? And a lot of the studies that I've seen on sewage cleanup, one-time sanitizing and cleaning may not get you to a safe level for those people to be in there from a category 3 loss. So it may take multiple cleanings in order to get down to a safe level. So ATP testing, again, is a way that you can do that, and you can look those up on the internet for a source or go to any of the suppliers that supply our industry and they would have those available. The meter is about $1,500, just in case you're wondering, and then the tests can be charged through Xactimate by test. As we go forward, the last part of this on categories regulated hazardous materials and mold. This is not a standalone category on its own. It's part of the project and may be included in the 3 categories that we've already discussed. So how this might work is, let's say you have lead paint in a category 2 loss. So the water is classified as a category 2, but you have lead paint available that you're going to have to demo, you're going to have to test or whatever. That would be a regulated hazardous material that is part of a category 2 loss. Okay, so they sort of work together. Now, there are regulated hazardous materials or mold where you may bring in a hygienist or an environmental person or another professional in the industry to come in and write a scope on how this is going to be taken care of or something like that. And those situations, you may not be demoing because of the category of loss of the water. You may be demoing because of what's present. So this works on the end of the categories and can be part of the categories themselves. There's a good section on that in this chapter and section of the actual standard. So tips for success on category before we move into class. First of all, when you provide documentation, don't just cut and paste from the standard and put it into your notes. Paint the picture. Be specific on each claim, because with all the data that insurance companies and TPAs have today, they know there's canned speeches that everybody's using. And each loss is not the same, so you can't have the same explanation every time. So paint the picture by telling me, do we have smell? Is there a discoloration? Were there feces that you saw in a category 3? Take a picture of them. You know, different things that could create a category to degrade. Fully document that. And it's also important that category of the loss is established when you first walk into the door. That tells you how you're going to handle that loss. Class, as we transition into class right now, class is after demo or remediation has been completed. And so you could come in on the first day and have a category 2 loss, that you have somebody that has a substantial amount of stuff packed into their basement, so it's going to take you a day just to get to the carpet. You would not actually determine the class of the loss until you got all the stuff moved out, you did any demo or remediation that you need to do, and then you would determine the class, because that's going to determine how much equipment you're going to need for drying that loss. And again, support and document this with photos and the documentation that you have in your companies. So here are our 4 classes. They remain the same, 4 classes, 1, 2, 3, and 4 as the previous standard. However, we've simplified class to have less variability. It's very straightforward today versus 5 years ago. So let's take a look at these individually. Class 1. Class 1 is where we have some materials that are affected, but not the entire area. And really the key on class is we're now using a representation of a percentage of the combined floor, wall, and ceiling surface area in the space that's affected to come up with class. So if you add up the 10 square feet on the floor and the 20 square feet on the wall and the 3 square feet on the ceiling, and you add up that square footage and divide by the total square feet of all the walls, floors, and ceilings in that room, and it comes up to less than 5%. Guess what? It's a class 1. So less than 5% is a class 1. As we go to a higher evaporation load or a higher amount of moisture in the structure, that's going to be in a class 2 situation, where then we have 5% to 40% of the combined floor, wall, and ceiling area. And then as we go to a class 3, this is where we're going to have the greatest amount of water absorption and what we call evaporation load, which means it's going to take more equipment, especially on the dehumidification side, to dry than a class 2 or 1. And here you're going to see the magic number is greater than 40% of the combined floor, wall, and ceiling surface area. So classes, and I just had a claim I was looking at for an insurance company this last week. Somebody was still quoting the old standard saying, well, we're wicked 18 inches up the wall, so this is a class X. Well, you know what? The math might have figured out that that was the class, but we shouldn't be using that terminology. Now we should be saying, you know what? More than 40% of the combined floor and wall ceiling space is actually affected and wet. Therefore, it's a class 3 water loss. The last one on the classes here is class 4. It's still very similar. It's deeply held or bound water. It's water that the surface moisture is going to evaporate off very quickly, but because of the porosity of the materials and how deep the moisture has soaked into the materials, it's going to be a slow release of moisture, which could take additional days of drying. For your information, when you go to equipment calculations, you're going to now see that the chart for equipment calculations for DHUs has changed slightly, and it's the same for Class 3 and Class 4 now. It used to be slightly different, but Class 3 and Class 4 have the same requirements as far as the factor chart that we teach in WRT and ASD. So that takes a look at class. Here is our entire look at class, all four of them together. Again, it's going to take differing levels of drying and equipment to dry them based on how much moisture we have to remove. And the other thing is, a lot of the TPAs and insurance companies, and even your customers are reading on the internet a lot of stuff that's not really true, but they're really stuck on 3 days of drying. I don't know if people have heard that before, but we hear it all the time. 3 days of drying really is not a standard at all. It's not in the standard. We need to use the proper number of days of drying to get the structure actually dry. And when you get to a Class 4 loss or a Class 3 loss, it might be 4 or 5 days of drying. And it's fine to do that, but what I'm going to tell you is what the insurance companies and TPAs are telling us is if it's going to be more than 3 days of drying, we want to have communication from you that that's happening, because that's going to open up bigger reserves to pay the claim. That means the claim's going to be higher than what we initially think given 3 days of drying. So the big thing on that whole 3 days of drying is to communicate with not only the customer, but with the insurance companies and TPAs to make sure that you're telling them, you can figure out a day or two into this that, hey, I think we're going to need 4 or 5 days. Make the call, put some notes in, send an email. We're going to be at 4 or 5 days of drying. You need to know that up front because we have a significant degree of moisture. We have deeply held or bound water. You can give them the reasons as a professional why the drying is going to take more than just 3 days. All right, so last thing on class, I want to reiterate this in the transition from category to class. Remember, category is contamination. Class is all about evaporation. Class is determined after demo and remediation activities are complete. So let's say you come into a loss. Once you sign a contract on that structure with the homeowner or owner of the structure, you are responsible for everything that happens in that structure at that point as far as the mitigation process and water damage goes. So if you come in and you're unable to complete the demo and remediation in the first few days, or it's a sewer loss and it's going to take a full day just to clean up, you still need to provide humidity control for that particular building. And sometimes you'll come in, it's a 3-story house, the ceilings are falling in, the water's been pouring down to it for 3 days, and you're going to need 2 or 3 days maybe for demo, depending on how big your crews are. You still need to provide humidity control and control the environment so we don't cause additional damage. And I've seen multiple companies get themselves in trouble because they've chose not to provide the humidity control, and then we have this thing called mold that starts growing 3 or 4 days into the demo, and guess who got blamed? The company, the contractor that was doing the work, and the insurance company now wants money. So in the standard, we talk about the fact that when you take over to do the mitigation and mitigate that loss, you're responsible to control humidity even if the demo isn't done. And you can document that simply by taking the readings every day on the DHU that's in there, documenting the fact that we're controlling humidity and making sure that we don't have secondary damage or additional damage due to high humidity levels. Because it's not just the water, the primary water, that causes problem. Secondary damage is a big part of our water losses. All right, other factors to look at for drying capacity. Believe it or not, there's a lot of influences to our drying. So even if you follow the formulas, you use class, you use the dehumidification formulas, there's a potential that your DHU is going to be not enough or too much. Just because the formula says this is what we need doesn't mean that's going to be exact. And the standard gives the technician and the company doing the mitigation the opportunity to, as a professional, to recommend additional dehumidification or less if needed based on the scenario at hand. So what are some of the things that influence this? One of the biggest is the HVAC systems that we have today in our houses. Our houses are tighter. We have heating, cooling, air conditioning going on. We have air exchange systems. We have these things called humidifiers that we put on our houses during the winter up here in the Midwest. And those humidifiers, the one on my house will keep up with a 70 to 80 pint dehumidifier, pint per pint, all day. So if I forget to shut that off and I have a water loss in my house, guess what? I've eliminated my 80 pint dehu because my little humidifier that's attached to my furnace is going to sense that the dehu is pulling down the level of humidity in the house, so it's going to kick on and kick moisture back in the house, and it will keep up with a 70 to 80 pint dehumidifier all day. So we need to understand HVAC systems and what is happening in the house. We can use the HVAC system to our advantage as far as providing additional heat to help dry the structure. And in some cases, we might use it for cooling if we have a lot of equipment and we have too much heat. The build-out density, what does it look like? What type of construction is it? Are there multiple layers? We get in older houses where you've got 4 layers of flooring. That's going to be a much different scenario to deal with than 1 layer. And then the last one is outdoor weather. And this is as simple as the customer deciding that it's too stuffy in there and opening all the windows when you're not there. I mean, outdoor weather can affect our drying inside the envelope of the house, even if the house is closed up. And so we need to be aware of these influences as well as we're drying. The standard in this chapter 10 does go through some of these and has some very good information in the reference guide on each of these and how they might affect your drying. So if you ever get a loss where you're sitting there and the thing's not going the direction you want as fast, maybe there's an outside factor pushing against your drying scenario that's causing a negative reaction, which means your drying's not happening as fast. One of these 4 could be that item. So take a look at this chapter. There's some good information there. Again, in the chapter part, the reference guide is where that's expanded on a little bit. Okay, dry standards. So ultimately, the best scenario is to find a dry standard on an unaffected material in the same building or structure, same type of unaffected material. Now, we don't always have those available, but whenever possible, you want to use an unaffected material. You don't want to make up dry standards. We see that a lot where people use canned dry standards, and you know what? Some of those might be valid in most cases. But I will tell you, in the winter up here when we have 2% relative humidity outside and it's very dry, our dry standard on a non-evasive meter might be 100 during the summer and it's 70 during the winter. So dry standards change based on the time of the year. If I'm in the south, in Louisiana or on a coastal state, I might have a whole different scenario there as far as the type of building materials that I use and the amount of moisture that they hold as well. So a best case scenario, again, use an unaffected material. Now, as far as the dry standard goes, there is one section and one chapter that talks about dry standards, and it is in chapter 10 and section 10. But in there, it actually talks about what is a dry standard, and it recommends that most materials are going to be dried within 10% of dry standard. And so what I did here is give you an example. So if we're using a relative reading, a non-evasive reading, and I put 2, I'm not promoting anybody here today, but I put SurveyMaster and Navigator in because those are the non-evasive meters we see the most often in the industry. If you're getting that relative reading and this dry standard was 80, within 10% would say once we get to 88 or below, that material is considered dry, okay? And that's how that sort of lays out. The exception is on solid hardwoods, they recommend within 4 percentage points. So take a dry standard of 10%. that wood would be considered dry at 14%. Now, the one thing about wood that you need to understand is there's some other numbers such as fungal growth begins at 16% and dry rot begins at 20% and wet rot at 30%. So if my dry standard's say 15, I may want to dry below the 16 because fungal growth can begin on wood at 16%, depending on the type of wood. So there's other factors that come in, but in the standard, these are the numbers that are thrown out as sort of guidance for getting to dry standard. And so you want to make sure you have a consistent message, use the same equipment on the same jobs whenever possible, because you can get 2 new meters and they can be off by as much as 10 or 15% right from the factory. So you want to make sure when possible use the same meters, use unaffected materials, and then try to use the guidelines for what our standards are here as far as what you have to be within. All right, going forward. So now we're going to transition into Chapter 13. So that's Chapter 10 really is some background information you sort of need to know before you get there. Chapter 13 is going to deal with some actual things that we come across, or Section 13 as well, in the structural restoration itself. And what I did is I pulled some items that both insurance companies and different contractors around the United States have brought to my attention that there's confusion about. So first and foremost is HEPA usage in a water loss. Okay, so why would we put HEPA filtration in? Well, allergies or health issues could be a reason. The level of contamination could be a reason. But another reason is this one that's listed on the slide. When you're drawing moist air out of a potentially contaminated cavity, you should use an inline HEPA filter, which I'm going to give you an example of floor drying. Using a mat system to dry floors. Those manufacturers of that equipment are now have created a smaller HEPA filter that can go in line prior to the blower, but between the blower and the mats themselves, that HEPA filters the air. And that's a little less expensive for the insurance company and yourselves running that type of system than, say, putting a 500 CFM HEPA filtration device in the room, okay? And there is line items in Xactimate, I believe, for these as well now. If there isn't, I know they're working on them, because this is a concern of what should be filtered and what shouldn't. And what we have to ask ourselves, whenever we put a mat system down to dry hardwood floors, let's say, or we're injecting air into a wall, which means we're putting positive pressure and we're blowing in, my question is always, where is the air coming from if you're pulling the air? And where is the air going to if you're pushing the air? And if you can't answer those questions, you need to find the answer to those questions, because we could be pushing contaminants or pulling contaminants to the living space of the occupants of the home. And if we go all the way back to the beginning of this presentation, one of our concerns was to protect the safety and well-being of the occupants and workers. So we need to provide HEPA filtration, and this is actually stated. This is not quoted exact, but this comes directly from the standard about providing HEPA filtration when we're using negative air pressure, pulling air, moist air from contaminated cavities, which could be interiors of walls on old houses. It could be in flooring. It could be a number of places that we would pull that air from. Make sure that we're actually cleaning that air before we have an opportunity to breathe it. All right. Antimicrobials is another area that gets a lot of press recently. So Category 1 pretty much says that we don't need an antimicrobial. Why? Because it's a Category 1. It's supposed to be clean water. It's not supposed to pose sickness or health. You will have customers, however, that have fear because of what they've seen on TV or what they've heard from their neighbor, and they will want something applied to protect themselves against mold or microbial growth or whatever. First of all, never go in and say we're going to kill everything with the products we're spraying down. Tell them what the product is actually doing and have a conversation. But if it's a Category 1 and the customer requests it, you can apply it. It's not in the standard that it has to be applied, and you can make the customer aware of that. But if they still want it, you can apply it, but you're probably not going to get reimbursed by the insurance company. So you have your choice of applying it for no cost to the customer or charging the customer for it. And what I see most people doing now is the latter, which means they're charging the customer for it. They're documenting that in the estimate that they applied an antimicrobial with a zero amount on the line to the insurance company and putting a note saying requested by customer, just to have full documentation that that product was applied. In a category 2 and 3, the key is before you apply the antimicrobial, you should be cleaning the surfaces, because our antimicrobials industry-wide are made, they're tested on clean, dry, non-porous surfaces, of which we really don't have a lot of that we're dealing with. So in order for that product to be most responsive for you and do the best job, we want to get rid of the excess debris. Do your extraction, do some cleaning, get the surfaces in fairly good shape before you do that initial application. Now, maybe in a category 3, you're going to make multiple applications, but on a regular loss, it's probably one application. And then the other thing that's come about recently is some of our products have residual that stays behind, which may or may not be healthy for the occupants of the home if it stays behind. So it is a recommendation that after the product is applied and proper dwell time by label directions is given, that you would then clean the treated surfaces as part of the remediation or mitigation process, which means mopping them. A lot of people will use a general purpose cleaner or whatever, but it's removing the residual product that may be left behind that could be a health hazard. And I've seen this a number of times where product has been left behind, a pet has gone down, they walk on it, they lick their feet, and basically the antimicrobial goes into the intestines of the pet, kills all the bugs that help with digestion, and you can probably imagine what happens then. The pet has a severe case of the runs, and the homeowner's not very happy. So we want to make sure that we do things properly, and this is one of the things that is not always being done in our industry right now. All right, next one, humidity control. This is actually called out in the standard in Chapter 13, Section 13. When we are doing our remediation or demo processes prior to our actual drying, because we want to get all the materials out that we aren't actually going to dry, or it takes extra resources, and that's just a poor use of resources, time, and also money for the homeowner or the insurance company. So to do things right, we do those processes first before the drying. However, during that process, we need to make sure we control humidity of the contaminated buildings. And so generally, some targets that we teach in class, relative humidity-wise, less than 60% relative humidity will assist us in preventing secondary damage in homes. So that we want to attain almost immediately when we're in the loss. And you can do this a number of ways, and WRT and ASD will help you in determining ways to do that. That's a whole different story. We're not going to go into it in depth today, but 60% relative humidity, our first goal. Then after 24 hours, we'd like to see 40%, and that's after 24 hours of drying. So our key goal during remediation and demo is to keep below 60%. Then once we set the drying up, we should be hitting that 40% number after approximately 24 hours of drying. So just a little tip there on humidity control. Now, I get a question a lot of times. I've got this split level home. The basement's wet. It's open to the upstairs. We put up containment to try to contain it, but it uses the same furnace system. So we're exchanging air all the time. And I go upstairs to take my unaffected reading, and I'm at 78% relative humidity. Is that a problem? It is a problem because you're over the 60%. And remember, when you have a contract signed to do work in a home, even if it's just the basement that's affected, you are still partially responsible for the upper level. And so if it is 78%, you document that. You put a dehumidifier in there to help control humidity. And the reality is, in a lot of these multi-level and split-level homes, you're really drying the entire structure, not just the affected area, because of how air does flow in those homes. So while the standard tries to be cut and dried and saying how things are going to work, sometimes we have to use common sense, and we have to be a little bit of a scientist on our own to say, where is makeup air coming from? Where is this moisture going from in this basement? Is it going to the upstairs? How is it getting there? Are there openings that I cannot close off, or is the furnace exchanging air? So make sure that we take a look at controlling the humidity in that entire building envelope until we're done with the drying process. And again, our drying process is targeting mainly materials, right? We're trying to dry the materials. Secondarily, we have to dry or remove moisture from the air, because as evaporation occurs, the moisture from the materials goes to the air. So our key concern is materials, but secondarily, the moisture that's in the air. All right, HVAC systems, specifically Category 2 and 3 losses. Had some issues with this recently, where some insurance companies have called and say, hey, what do we do? We've got issues. Well, as you all know, everybody cleans their HVAC system every year, so it should be nice and squeaky clean inside the HVAC system. And you know that was a poor joke, so we'll just go forward and say, we know they don't clean their HVAC systems on a regular basis, and there's a lot of contaminants that build up inside them. Add Category 2, which, by the way, does contain a significant amount of chemical, biological, or physical contamination, or Category 3, which is grossly unsanitary water, to that system, and we have a petri dish that can grow things. So in the standard, there is a section on HVAC in Chapter 3, Section 3, that talks about containing, disassembling, and removing system components, and cleaning the components using a specialized HVAC contractor. So if you are not somebody that is a professional in, say, duct cleaning or HVAC cleaning, you should hire somebody that has that profession that can clean the components whenever Category 2 or 3 water has entered those components. One of the things that we see quite a bit is where we have basements up here or even slab on grade. A lot of time they like to run the HVAC system underneath the floor, and then it comes up. So if the floor floods, water then goes into the HVAC system and creates problems. So this is something where I will tell you 10 years ago, we probably just sucked it out, did the best we can, but HVAC system pumps air continuously through a building. It's one of the quickest ways we can spread contaminants. So the IICRC in the revision of this S500 is taking a more proactive approach on ensuring the safety of the occupants and workers by cleaning those properly. All right, next thing, monitoring. This one always comes into play, especially if you get really busy, but we talk about monitoring daily, no exceptions. And the reason for monitoring daily is there need to be changes made to your drying setup on a daily basis to ensure that, number one, we aren't wasting the customer or the insurance company's money by just letting equipment sit. We can reposition equipment to get the drying done quicker. The customer's going to be happy, but you're also going to prevent the opportunity for secondary damage, which could include microbial growth, by getting the structure dry quicker. And so if the customer is unavailable, make arrangements to get in, either from their neighbor, a garage code, checking a key. I know a lot of people put lock boxes on homes now, like realtors do. So those are all options for you to get into the house. If the customer does not allow you access, you need to document that in your notes to make sure that is clearly states customer did not allow access, because if there's ever a problem with the loss later, you're going to want that to back yourselves up. All right, so last section we're going to talk about, Section 17, Chapter 17. The chapter part of this is probably one of the best additions to the S500 of all the additions that have been made. And the reason is it takes away a lot of the variability, and it also helps our younger employees as far as experience in working through a loss, because it lays some things out. So let's take a look at Chapter 17 in the reference guide. I took gypsum board, also known as wall board, drywall, sheetrock, plasterboard, okay? They've got about 50 to 60 different materials in this Chapter 17, where we actually tell you what the assembly is. In the middle, the characteristics of that. And then it tells you how you're going to handle this material for a category 1, 2, and 3. And a lot of times when adjusters or insurance companies call me for advice on a claim they're working for, this is one of the sections I go to because it really does explain what's the restorability, how do we do extraction, how's cleaning handled, how's drying handled. And so if we take gypsum wallboard, for instance, here, and I go to a category 1, and it has a code B, so there's a bunch of codes for each of the restorability, extraction, cleaning prior to the list of different assemblies or materials. And so if I go and look at restorability code B, that says that in most cases, on a category 1, gypsum board is generally restorable. Okay, so we can restore it. Now, what do I have to do for extraction? Well, B and C are the two that come up if you go to the chart. B says that we can extract and remove water, and then C says we may have to have follow-up extraction needed due to seepage. So depending on the situation, if there is water in the walls that hasn't all come out on your first extraction, you may need additional extraction on your next visit or later in that visit as well. So this lays it out very easily, and this is for every category. I'm just going through category 1 because it's the short, easy one, and that will keep us in our time frame that we have to be in today. But if you go and look at category 2 and category 3, it's also going to tell you how to handle each of these. How about cleaning? Well, cleaning, we've got lots of options. We can do bulk removal of debris and unsalvageable materials if there are some in a category 1. We can do controlled demolition. We can do detailed cleaning by damp wiping, by vacuuming, and then there might be a final appearance cleaning. These are all things that could happen to gypsum board in a category 1 as far as cleaning goes. Then we look at drying, open assemblies to access pockets of saturation, maintain water vapor pressure differentials in all phases. Okay, so if I've got a new technician that's just coming into the industry and they went through WRT, and when they come to WRT, if I'm their instructor, I tell them, if anything, go back and get used to Chapter 17 in the reference guide, because it's going to walk you through the different assemblies and materials until you get some experience under your belt. And we're going to have less people making mistakes in the field, which is going to limit your liability, and it's going to dry the structure. So here, it says I can open up drywall or gypsum board. It says I want to maintain water vapor pressure differentials in all phases of the process. So it's leading me through how I'm going to actually dry this structural material. The last thing, airflow, continuous airflow. Introduce airflow within the structural cavity. I know a lot of new employees come and they know dehues and they know air movers, but they don't know an injection system, or they don't know a floor mat system. This might remind them that, hey, we can introduce airflow within the structure. So either we pop holes below the baseboard, or do we put an injection system in? Now, in this business, I'm about two things: doing what's right, ethically and morally right, and also making money. If we don't make money as an industry, we're not going to be in the business anymore. And I think this chapter in the reference guide does a very good job of reminding not only us as owners and managers, but also employees and technicians of the steps really required. And it may actually trigger some things to say, hey, you know what? Maybe I should be putting an injection system in this, which, by the way, is going to help dry better because you're going to get airflow on both sides of the material, and it's going to put more money in your pocket. So not only does it give you things that you should do in a loss, it gives you justification for things you should do in a loss as far as those different materials go. So again, 50 to 60 materials. There's also at the bottom, you'll see the Gypsum Association here was quoted for some information. So there's some sources provided with that. But this standard is a great living document that gives you a lot of information on how to properly process the loss from start to finish and make money while you're doing it, because it gives you justification for what you're doing. All right, so where can I get a copy? I told you I'd give you that before we left today. So first and foremost, go to IICRC.org. we have a web store, and I believe if you go to the upper right of the website, you'll see web store. And from there, you can buy hard copies. I think if you buy one, they're $125 each. If you buy multiple copies, I think there might be a discount. There's also a subscription, and I would tell you, if you're in the restoration industry today, I would really recommend that you do the subscription. It's electronic media, and the nice thing about it is you pay $165 to $180 depending on the type of subscription you get, but you get all the standards. So you get the carpet upholstery, you get the new trauma standard, and the thing is, if you have a subscription, whenever the standards are updated, when you go to your website to access the standard, you automatically have the updated information. And so, and then if you need multiple logins, you can purchase those at a discounted price, and it's not $160. It's like $20 or $40 per additional login. So the electronic delivery of the standards is really good. You can print off certain pages. You can pull it up and read by section. You can search them. It's a very good way to have the standard in your business and have everybody have that available. So again, nice thing about this, if you're in water damage restoration, you probably do mold as well. You get the S520, you get the S540, the new trauma standard, and you get the carpet and upholstery and some of the other ones. All the standards that are currently published and active, you would have access to through digital media. So that brings me to the end of the presentation, right on schedule. At this point, if you have some questions, you can type them in the chat and we'll try to give you some answers. So I hope that we triggered some things, made you think about some things today. We're going to continue to provide certified firms some webinars like this, and they're going to cover all different topics in the industry. But we'll give a couple more minutes here for questions. Any other questions? All right. Well, I think I do not see any other questions coming up. Please check out the IICRC.org to get a copy of the standard. And I thank you all for your attendance today. Have a good day.
Thank everybody for joining. And as a reminder, this webinar will be hosted on the IICRC Certified Firm website for review at a later date. Thank you.